Hey, fifth period APUSHers. Today's lecture on the Stalemated 70s is the one we didn't have time for the other day due to class meetings, so please pay attention to it. Take notes if you need to, look along with your key concepts, and remember, I'll be referencing the video we watched in class. If you didn't get a chance to see the video, let me know. Our objectives for today are to analyze the domestic issues of the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, as well as to evaluate the international issues of the 70s, including Cold War issues in Détente, China, the Camp David Accords, the Iran hostage crisis, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Themes that permeate with the 70s. And the first is as the war in Vietnam finally came to a disastrous conclusion, the U.S. struggled to create a more stable international climate. Détente with the two powers, communist powers, temporarily reduced Cold War tensions, but trouble in the Mideast threatens America's energy supplies and economic stability, and we're going to see the Middle East become an increasingly important region of the world to the United States. The second theme focuses on the political difficulties of the time period and the fact that, weakened by the political difficulties, the administrations had trouble coping with America's growing economic problems. In fact, economic problems plagued the 1970s and will be one of the leading reasons for the distrust that began to take place against the government, as well as for the conservative revolution that was already going on and that will culminate in the 80s with the Reagan Revolution. Most of us know President Nixon for Watergate. However, President Nixon, while perceptions of Watergate are not so good, was actually known as a pretty good president when it came to foreign affairs, and much of that was due to his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Nixon and Kissinger believed in a policy of realpolitik, and what that means is that the United States should pursue policies and make alliances based on our national interests rather than on any particular worldview or ideology. And that the reality was that a balance of power between a healthy and strong United States, Europe, the Soviet Union, China, and Japan would lead to a safer world and a better world as a result. And the key to this balance was détente. Prior to the February 1972 meeting between Nixon and Kissinger with China's Mao, Secretary of State Kissinger had secretly traveled to China to meet with the Chinese government officials. In February 1972, this meeting was historic in the fact that we reversed a policy of not recognizing Communist China, a policy that had been in place since 1949. Additionally, we agreed to support China's admission to the United Nations, and we agreed to pursue economic and cultural exchanges. For those of you who've watched Forrest Gump, that ping pong tournament and ping pong competition was the real deal that really did occur between China and the United States since 1972. Ultimately, we're also going to play the China card with our other communist rival, the Soviet Union. And by playing the China card, Nixon and Kissinger are able to establish a period that is known as détente, a period which lasts from 1972 through 1979, and it was the second thaw in the Cold War, in a way similar to the peaceful coexistence policies of the 1950s. In many respects, Nixon's visit to both the Soviet Union and China was used as an effort to force North Korea to come to the negotiating table regarding Vietnam, and to that degree he was successful, and we withdrew from Vietnam in 1973. But more importantly, the era of détente led to several notable changes in relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. The first and most important were some very serious arms control treaties. The SALT I Treaty, which SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, was signed in May 1972, and essentially the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to stop making nuclear ballistic missiles. Furthermore, an ABM treaty was later signed, in which us and the Soviet Union agreed to reduce the number of ABMs to 200 for each power. In addition to deals over arms control, we signed a grain deal with the Soviet Union, a 3-year arrangement by which we agreed to sell at least $750 million worth of wheat, corn, and other cereals to the Soviet Union, something that continued well into the 80s. Finally, the high point of the Arab Détente was the Helsinki Conference of July 1975. President Ford, this was held during President Ford's presidency, and essentially this was a group of agreements that officially ended World War II. Remember, we never had a treaty that ended World War II. We agreed to recognize the legitimacy of the boundaries in Eastern Europe that had been dictated by the Soviet Union, and in turn they guaranteed more liberal exchanges of people and information between the East and the West, and also a pledge to protect certain basic human rights. This never really quite happened, and even though détente does not formally end until 1975, after President Carter's inauguration, relations with the Soviet Union begin to deteriorate due to Carter's humanitarian foreign policy. As stated earlier, détente does end in 1979 with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And when we look at détente, overall it was fairly successful. We were able to checkmate and co-opt the two great communist powers. We were able to end the Vietnam War. And even though it didn't end the arms race, it did lead to reduced armaments and to a precedent that would later on involve even the reduction of even more armaments between Reagan and Gorbachev in the late 1980s. While our policies with the communist powers improved in the 1970s, our policies with the Middle East became of real concern to many Americans. In 1973, the first energy crisis occurred, and sometimes this is also called the oil crisis. And this was really a major cause of the U.S. economic troubles of the 1970s. A little bit of background, we had supported the nation of Israel since its creation in 1948. And in 1973, Israel's Arab neighbors, including Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, as well as others, surprise attacked Israel on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, leading to the Yom Kippur War of 1973. We airlifted weapons to the Israelis, and as a result, the Arab states established an oil boycott against the United States and other Western nations for their support. They wanted us to help force Israel to return lands controlled not only from the Yom Kippur War, in which they were able to defeat the Arab states, but also the Six-Day War back in 1967. Kissinger eventually negotiated the withdrawal of Israel west of the Suez Canal, and the Arabs lifted their boycott. However, OPEC is instead going to increase prices, and OPEC countries, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq, raised the price of oil from $3 a barrel to almost $12 a barrel in an attempt to force the United States to recognize the PLO and support other Arab demands. As a result, our gas prices essentially quadrupled from about 30 cents a gallon to about $1.20 a gallon, and inflation shot up above 10%. Nixon at the time refused to ration gasoline, and acute gasoline shortage is going to ensue. However, it is going to help lead to energy policies by 1974 and 75 that are going to begin to transform the United States. One of those being the fact that the federal government promised to withhold any highway funds to any states that did not lower the maximum speed limit to 55. And after the speed limit helped to end the energy crisis, as well as other measures, the use of smaller cars and so forth, although it did end, the speed limit will remain 55 until around 1985 or 86. It was found that 55 not only saved gas, but also saved lives. Earlier, environmental concerns began to be addressed in a major way during the 1970s. And the background to some of these environmental concerns goes back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Written in 1962, it exposed the poisonous effects of pesticides. Think Agent Orange and other pesticides such as that. The Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970, as was the Clean Air Act, and Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, is really seen as a symbolic beginning of the nation's environmental era. In addition to the Clean Air Act and EPA, later on in the 1970s, we will see Clean Air and Water Acts even contributing more to environmental cleanup. And progress will be made in subsequent decades in just removing automobile emissions and cleansing up polluted rivers and lakes. With that said, another issue was the issue of toxic waste. Um, in the video that you watched, I showed you the example of the Love Canal in New York, where soil and groundwater was so polluted, the EPA declared the town unfit for habitation, and residents were evacuated, homes boarded up, and the community sealed off. Later on, a Superfund was established by Carter in 1980 to clean up toxic dumps, and the impact was by 1980 the release of toxic chemicals went down about 46%. A cleaner alternative to toxic waste would be nuclear power. However, in March of 1979, the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history occurred outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, at a nuclear plant called 3 Mile Island. The core released radioactive water and steam, and officials feared a massive radiation release. As a result, the reactor was shut down for 6 years. 100,000 residents were evacuated, and although the release never came, environmental groups are going to step up their protests against nuclear power. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 is going to increase the area of protected land and water by about 300%. And some of the recovered species will include the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, as well as the gray whale. As far as energy policies, there will be criticism, mainly from business. Wetland regulations, endangered species acts imposed, restrictions on landowners, and too much valuable land was taken off production, off the rolls for those who criticize the policies. In addition to that, some big business, critics charge that, environmental legislation would lead to overregulation of businesses and increased costs. And these debates really do continue until today. As I stated earlier, the United States in the 1970s went through a pretty rough period of its economy. And this was the era of stagflation, a very odd period in which there was double-digit unemployment as well as double-digit inflation. There are many reasons for the terrible economy, including the fact that we discussed earlier, the energy crisis of 1973 and the oil embargo. But some others, underlying causes also include the federal deficits that were built up during the 1960s to pay for both LBJ's Great Society programs as well as the Vietnam War. Another reason for some of the economic problems was the fact that international competition had really upped its game during the 60s and 70s. And the automobile industry is a perfect example of this. By the 1970s, many American automakers were losing profits to companies from Germany and Japan, which were perceived as having superior products to the American automobiles. Another reason for the economic problems of the 1970s was the fact that there was increased numbers of women and teenagers in the workforce who were only working part-time jobs. They were less likely to develop the skills in the long term, and this led to some unemployment amongst people who were unable to get full-time jobs. And finally, just the shift of the economy. This was a very early shift going from manufacturing to the service industry, and it was more difficult to achieve productivity. Like I said, by the mid-70s, plaguing the Ford and Carter administrations will be the stagflation, with slowing productivity, rising inflation, a very rare phenomenon, slowdown in industry, and overall just a really rough economic period. In addition to the economic troubles of the 70s, there was some notable legislation that occurred during the Nixon era in the early 70s. Included amongst that will be some issues dealing with civil rights. The Supreme Court ordered busing of students in 1971 to help to achieve school desegregation. We watched the example in Boston that was on the video the other day, and Nixon had actually proposed an anti-busing bill, but it had been blocked by Congress. Nixon did, however, try to further affirmative action by establishing goals and timetables for companies to hire women and minorities, something known as the Philadelphia Plan. Critics, of course, charged Nixon with trying to weaken labor unions by using affirmative action for hiring practices, But regardless, we will see some increase in affirmative action laws during the Nixon era. In addition, the 26th Amendment was passed during this time period, which gave 18-year-olds the right to vote, triggered by the draft in Vietnam, in which 18-year-olds were allowed to die for their country. The 26th Amendment reduced the voting age to 18. There were also increased Social Security benefits and food stamps during the early 1970s, and the creation of OSHA, which would be an agency that would monitor worker safety conditions. In 1972, Nixon ran for re-election, and the Democrats had nominated someone named George McGovern, who was really hampered by a party that was divided amongst itself. Nixon's vice presidential running mate Spiro Agnew was also renominated, and they emphasized that they were winding down the war in Vietnam. They had reduced troops from 540,000 to about 30,000, and ultimately the election resulted in a landslide victory for Nixon and the Republican Party. However, while the presidential Republicans won the election, the Republicans suffered losses in both houses of Congress, which kind of reduced Nixon's mandate for his policies. As far as Nixon's second term, however, the biggest presidential scandal in U.S. history, Watergate, ultimately led to his resignation. Nixon sought to secretly attack political opponents. He always surrounded himself with people who almost always agreed with him, thus protecting himself from criticism. And in 1971, Nixon's men gathered a list of 200 individuals and 18 organizations that the administration regarded as enemies, including Congressman Edward Kennedy, McGovern, the entire black leadership in Congress, some college presidents, actors such as Paul Newman and Steve McQueen and Jane Fonda, and other members of the media. Nixon had asked the FBI to spy on these individuals, try to discredit them. He had ordered the IRS to harass them with tax audits. And the FBI did block an illegal Nixon plan for a secret police operation to combat the anti-war movement. Nixon was afraid the anti-war movement would undo him like it did Johnson. Remember, in 1971, we were still fighting in Vietnam. Also, Nixon was worried about the outcome of the 1972 election, and his attorney general set up CREEP and began a massive illegal fundraising campaign. CREEP stands for the Committee to Re-elect the President. Money was set aside in a special fund to pay for dirty trick operations against Nixon's Democratic opponents, and basically these, even people within the White House known as plumbers instructed to stop anti-Nixon leaks to the press. Ultimately, CREEP's Special Investigation Unit broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg, who had been the author of the Pentagon Papers, and even broke into, not in his office, but his psychiatrist's office, but found nothing embarrassing. But in the summer 1972, burglars hired by CREEP were caught breaking in to the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Nixon and his aides denied any involvement in the break-in and embarked on a massive cover-up, and the public initially believed them. However, two young Washington Post journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, broke the story. Investigations revealed that the two of the Watergate burglars and a White House aide involved in the burglary were employees of CREEP, and discovered other illegal activities conducted by the president's advisors. Nixon had secretly authorized hush money of more than $460,000 in CREEP funds to keep the burglars quiet. And in 1973, the Watergate trial and Senate hearings revealed Nixon and other White House officials had basically covered up their involvement and pressured defendants to plead guilty and remain silent. The Senate committee called on Nixon to surrender tapes of conversations that might pertain to the Watergate break-in. Nixon refused and claimed executive privilege and stated the release of the tapes would endanger national security. At one point, Nixon fired two of his men for refusing to fire a special prosecutor of Watergate before a third Nixon aide finally did fire him, which the public was outraged. And to make matters worse, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned in October 1973. He had been accused and pleaded no contest to charges of income tax evasion and accepting bribes while governor of Maryland, and resigned the vice presidency. Nixon then nominated Gerald R. Ford, the popular conservative House Minority Leader, to become VP, and that's how Ford later on becomes the first president that was not elected by the people. Nixon does finally release edited transcripts of the tapes, but the most incriminating portions had been erased, especially a critical 18-minute gap. And when Nixon refused to release unedited tapes, special prosecutors took the case to the Supreme Court. The court ruled unanimously that Nixon had to release the tapes, and the House committee in July is going to begin impeachment proceedings in 1974. They were essentially, before Nixon could be impeached, he did hand over the tapes, which did reveal a cover-up. Impeachment seemed certain, but to avoid impeachment, in 1974, Nixon resigned, and Gerald Ford is sworn in as president. President Ford pardons Nixon for any crimes he may have committed while president, and while many Americans were outraged and wondered if a deal had been made, the pardon probably cost Gerald Ford the presidency in 1976. In light of Vietnam, Americans grew more skeptical of the government, and ultimately 31 Nixon administration officials were convicted and went to prison for Watergate-related offenses. Gerald Ford and his pardons of Nixon brought immediate controversy, and unfortunately for Gerald Ford, the economy did not improve while he was president. In fact, in April 1975, South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam, and ultimately, the election of 1976, Ford was defeated by the Democratic nominee Jimmy Carter, former governor of Georgia, who ran as an outsider. The election of Carter, who was one of the most conservative Democrats in office, probably the most conservative Democrat since Grover Cleveland during the Gilded Age, had questioned a few things. He welcomed an increased role of religion in public life. He questioned some government policies, and ultimately, as Carter won and large Democratic majorities in both houses, we see a new or continuation of the same era. Domestically, a few of the things that Carter did. He did offer amnesty for Vietnam War draft dodgers, pardoned over 10,000 draft evaders, which was one of his campaign pledges. He also created the Department of Education and the Department of Energy. And at one point, he proposed raising the tax on gasoline and taxing autos that use fuel inefficiently in order to reduce U.S. dependence on foreign oil. He only got a small portion of the bill through Congress. And later on, we're going to see another energy crisis in 1979. But as far as the economy, stagflation continued. Even with an $18 billion tax cut in 1978, by 1980, inflation was still 12%. Sales of automobiles and houses suffered, and unemployment was at almost 8%. One other thing that Carter did was deregulation. Another very conservative measure, and this included deregulation of air transportation, and will continue on to the 1980s as Reagan continues many of deregulation policies that Carter had begun. As far as foreign policy goes, Carter is known for humanitarian diplomacy. He sought to base foreign policy on human rights, but was criticized for inconsistency and lack of attention to U.S. interests. In many ways, the policy, although with good intentions, was somewhat hypocritical. For example, he verbally lashed out at Cuba, one of our enemies, for human rights violations, as well as the Soviet Union. Other countries included Uganda. He cut foreign aid to Argentina, Uruguay, and Ethiopia. He championed the black majority in South Africa and denounced apartheid. And while these policies, these humanitarian policies were actually a good thing in many ways, he didn't punish South Korea or the Philippines, countries that often also had severe human rights violations because they were too vital to U.S. security. And ultimately, humanitarian diplomacy proved to be ineffective. President Carter was also known for signing the Panama Canal Treaty of 1977, which provided for transfer of ownership of the canal to Panama in 1999 and guaranteed its neutrality. Carter's greatest achievement was perhaps the Camp David Accords, in which he convinced Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to come to Camp David and participate in 13 days of peace talks, in which he persuaded them to sign an accord that basically put the two countries on a solid road towards peace. Egypt was able to gain land that Israel occupied, the Sinai Peninsula, and in return, Egypt offered to recognize Israel's right to exist. This was pretty controversial, as Egypt was the first Arab state to do so, and ultimately Sadat was assassinated by Arab extremists who did not want to recognize Israel's right to exist. Yet, this does go down historically as most likely his greatest achievement. However, it was totally overshadowed by the Iran hostage crisis. In 1978, a revolution forced the Shah of Iran to flee the country, the Islamic Revolution. And the Shah was a bad guy, but he was our bad guy. He had Western reforms, but he had also used secret police and was really, not a democratic leader at all. The Ayatollah Khomeini, pictured on the left, was a religious leader who had been in exile in France, came back to become Iran's leader. And he reversed much of these reforms and established a conservative Islamic social order. For the most part, the CIA, like I said, had put the Shah in power. And afterwards, President Carter allowed the Shah, after he was forced out of Iran, to come to the U.S. for medical treatment while in exile. In response, about 400 Iranians, many of them students, broke into the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on November 4th, taking the occupants captive. If you ever see the movie Argo, it kind of shows the events of that time period. They demanded the Shah be returned to Iran for trial and that his wealth be confiscated, given to Iran. Carter instead froze Iranian assets in the U.S. and initiated a trade embargo against Iran. They did eventually free the African American and women hostages, but kept 52 others. And at one point, President Carter ordered a Marine rescue attempt, but it failed after several helicopters broke down in another crash, killing 8 men in the North African desert. The Iranian hostage crisis led to the perception of Carter as being weak, indecisive, and ineffective, and he suffered for it in the elections. After extensive negotiations with Iran, Carter released Iranian hostages, and after 444 days in captivity, the hostages were freed on January 20th, 1980, and as a final insult to Carter, it was released after Reagan took his inaugural oath. Ultimately, this led to the last portrayed America as the Great Satan, and to this day, we do not have diplomatic relations with Iran. Picture of the hostages as well. And finally, some other Cold War politics. Prior to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we actually did begin meeting with the Soviet Union in regards to an extension of the SALT treaties. And being SALT 1 was expired in 1977, Carter wanted to renew the SALT Accords and extend them to include more reductions in nuclear armaments. And in 1979, Carter signed SALT 2 with the Soviet Union. However, in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. This was the end of Détente. The Senate did not ratify SALT 2, and Carter proclaimed the U.S. would use any means necessary, including force, to protect against Soviet aggression. He stopped shipments of grain and certain advanced technology to the Soviet Union, and we even boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics that were held in Moscow. And in retaliation, the Soviets boycotted the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. Regarding Afghanistan, the Soviets met stiff resistance, became known as the Russia's Vietnam, and the Soviets stayed in Afghanistan until 1989 when they finally pulled out. The Iranian freedom fighters, known as the Mujahideen, that were fighting against the Soviets, were recipients of U.S. aid. Later, these freedom fighters, the Mujahideen, became known as the Taliban. I will see you guys Sunday night at 5 o'clock for the practice test, and Don't forget to do your readings for Monday in class. I hope you enjoyed this PowerPoint.